The political landscape is so often a theater of carefully rehearsed statements and diplomatic double-talk, where true intentions are buried under layers of bureaucracy and polite fiction, but every so often, a moment of brutal, unvarnished clarity cuts through the noise and forces the entire world to stop and stare at an uncomfortable truth it usually prefers to ignore. And that is precisely what happened when former President Donald Trump declared that the United States would not be leaving Iraq without getting paid, a statement so raw in its transactional nature that it effectively reframed nearly 2 decades of warfare, nation-building, and geopolitical strategy as little more than a delinquent invoice waiting to be settled. Let's strip away the initial shock for a moment and truly grapple with the magnitude of what was being said. This wasn't a policy proposal debated in the halls of Congress or a position paper from the State Department. This was a public assertion that a sovereign nation, a country where hundreds of thousands of civilians have lost their lives and whose social fabric has been irrevocably altered by a conflict initiated from the outside, now owed a debt for the very intervention that caused that chaos. This concept, when you follow its logical conclusion, is staggering because it suggests that international relations are not governed by alliances, shared security interests, or moral imperatives, but by a simple balance sheet where military might equates to a right of collection. The immediate reaction within Iraq was a firestorm of unified fury, a rare moment where Shiite, Sunni, and Kurdish politicians, who are often locked in bitter power struggles, found a common voice in condemning this as a violation of their sovereignty that treated their homeland not as a partner but as a vassal state, while on the global stage, American allies in Europe shifted uncomfortably. Their delicate diplomatic framework suddenly rendered naive, and adversaries like Russia and China eagerly amplified the message as proof of their long-standing accusations of Western neocolonialism. But to understand why this statement was even possible, we must rewind the tape and look at the American domestic context, a nation that has been psychologically and financially drained by what it widely terms as the forever wars. The cost of the Iraq War for the United States is not just a number in a budget report, it is a visceral, open wound represented by the thousands of flag-draped coffins of its service members, the struggling veterans battling invisible wounds, and a national treasury that has been hemorrhaging money, over $2 trillion by conservative estimates, a figure so vast it becomes abstract, meaning it could have rebuilt America's crumbling infrastructure 10 times over or funded a generation of scientific research. This national fatigue, this palpable sense of having given too much blood and treasure for too little in return, is the fertile ground in which a statement like, "We need to get paid," takes root and flourishes, resonating deeply with a segment of the population that feels their country has been played for a sucker on the world stage, acting as a global policeman who not only works for free but pays for the privilege. This sentiment transforms the complex, morally ambiguous history of the Iraq intervention into a simple, emotionally satisfying narrative of a bad business deal, and it is this powerful, albeit reductive, narrative that gives the statement its political potency, allowing it to be framed not as an extortionate demand but as a common-sense call for fiscal responsibility and national pride. Yet, this framing completely sidesteps the other side of the ledger, the incalculable cost borne by Iraq itself, a nation that did not invite the initial invasion based on premises that proved to be false, a society that was plunged into a sectarian civil war, its ancient cultural heritage looted, its cities reduced to rubble, and its people displaced by the millions. A human cost that no currency in the world can ever truly compensate. To then present that nation with a bill for its own destabilization is a move that exists in a legal and ethical vacuum, challenging the very foundations of post-World War II international law and norms, which, however imperfectly applied, were built on concepts of sovereignty and the prohibition of aggressive war for territorial or financial gain. This declaration, therefore, is far more than a headline. It is a key that unlocks a dangerous new paradigm, one where power is not just projected but is monetized, and it sets the stage for the single most critical question that every investor, every policymaker, and every concerned global citizen must now ask: what would this payment actually look like in practice, and what would its immediate, catastrophic impact be on the lifeblood of the Iraqi state and the global economy at large? So we arrive at the heart of the matter, the multi-trillion-dollar question that hangs over the entire globe like a specter: what form could this demanded payment possibly take, and how would its extraction be executed without immediately triggering the total collapse of the Iraqi state? The notion of Iraq simply writing a check from its central bank reserves is a fiscal fantasy, the nation's entire economy, with a GDP hovering around $250 billion, is dwarfed by the estimated $2 to $3 trillion total cost of the war to the U.S. Treasury, a sum so colossal that demanding its repayment would be the economic equivalent of demanding a personal loan from someone living on a minimum wage salary to cover the national debt. Therefore, the only conceivable mechanism, the only viable currency for a transaction of this grotesque scale, is not cash but control, specifically control over Iraq's most precious and only internationally viable asset, its vast and easily accessible oil reserves. Imagine a scenario where the negotiation is not about withdrawal timelines or political reconciliation, but about the direct and overt transfer of ownership or long-term extraction rights for some of the world's most lucrative oil fields, places like Rumaila, West Kurna, and Kirkuk, to American corporate entities, potentially with direct or indirect backing from the U.S. government, under terms so coercively favorable that they would make the historical concessions of the colonial era look like fair market deals. This is not a hypothetical exercise. We have a precedent in the immediate aftermath of the 2003 invasion when the Coalition Provisional Authority issued Order 39, which opened up the Iraqi economy to 100% foreign ownership in all sectors except oil, a move that was followed by a series of no-bid contracts awarded to major Western oil companies, setting a clear historical pattern of leveraging military occupation for economic access. A modern, explicit demand for payment would be the final, logical, and most brutal culmination of that pattern, removing any remaining pretense and forcing the Iraqi government to sign over the deed to its future prosperity under the explicit threat of an indefinite and financially crippling military presence. The immediate and utterly predictable consequence would be a seismic eruption of public fury within Iraq, rendering any government that agreed to such terms instantly illegitimate and likely sparking a unified armed resistance that would make the previous insurgencies look like minor skirmishes, as the population would be fighting not for political power but for the very survival of their nation's patrimony. Beyond Iraq's borders, the shockwaves would instantly dismantle the fragile architecture of the global oil market, OPEC, of which Iraq is a foundational member with one of the largest production quotas, would see its entire supply management system thrown into chaos as a significant portion of Iraqi output would suddenly fall under the direct control of a geopolitical rival, effectively giving the U.S. an unprecedented lever to manipulate global oil prices by either flooding the market to bankrupt competitors like Russia or withholding supply to create artificial scarcity and inflict economic pain on adversaries like China. This would transform oil from a commodity influenced by market forces into a direct and overt weapon of foreign policy, triggering retaliatory measures from other petrostates that could range from launching their own price wars to forming a new, anti-American energy alliance, creating a level of volatility and uncertainty that would send the price of gasoline at pumps in America, Europe, and across the developing world on a roller coaster of spikes and crashes, directly impacting the cost of living for billions of people and fueling inflation in every sector of the global economy. The geopolitical fallout would be equally instantaneous and severe, with Iran, which has spent decades and immense resources building political and military influence within Iraq, viewing such a permanent and resource-backed American entrenchment on its western border as an existential threat comparable to a declaration of war, likely prompting a massive escalation in its own proxy activities, potentially including direct attacks on those very oil installations, drawing the entire region into a new, hot conflict with far greater stakes than before. This direct and unbreakable linkage between a political demand for compensation and the core engine of the Iraqi economy brings us to the epicenter of the financial blast zone, the one asset that has become a symbol of both Iraq's potential and its perpetual fragility, and the focal point of intense, and often misguided, speculation, the Iraqi dinar, whose fate in this doomsday scenario would not be the revaluation dreamt of by internet gurus, but a collapse so swift and so total it would serve as a case study for generations of economists on how to destroy a national currency overnight. And so we arrive at the final, and for many, the most personal dimension of this entire crisis, the catastrophic impact on the Iraqi dinar and the millions of people, from ordinary Iraqi citizens to international speculators, whose futures are tied to its fate. For years, a powerful and persistent narrative has swirled around the dinar, a compelling story sold through online forums, dedicated gurus, and YouTube channels that paints a picture of an inevitable and glorious revaluation, a moment where the currency, currently trading at over 1,000 to the US dollar, will suddenly skyrocket in value, transforming small, speculative investments into life-changing fortunes. The core of this seductive fantasy rests on a simple premise, that Iraq's astronomical oil wealth, one of the largest proven reserves on the planet, is not yet reflected in its currency's value, and that once the nation achieves stability and its oil flows freely onto the global market without constraint, the dinar will be recalibrated to mirror this underlying economic strength, rewarding those prescient enough to have bought in early. The brutal, unyielding reality imposed by a demand for massive financial compensation eviscerates this fantasy completely, exposing it as a dangerous illusion built on a fundamental misunderstanding of both geopolitics and basic economics. Let's be unequivocally clear, the statement, "we won't leave until we get paid," does not create a path to revaluation, it constructs a highway leading directly to the currency's utter devaluation and potential collapse. The mechanism for this is not complex. It is the grim, unforgiving math of national finance. The Central Bank of Iraq currently maintains the dinar's value through a managed float, a process that requires it to possess massive reserves of US dollars, which it uses to intervene in the foreign exchange market, buying and selling dinars to maintain stability. The primary, and almost exclusive, source of those crucial dollar reserves is the revenue generated from the sale of Iraqi oil. If the Iraqi government is forced to divert this river of dollar revenue, not for rebuilding its own country or investing in its people, but to service an immense, externally imposed debt to the United States, either through direct payments or, more likely, by surrendering the future revenue from its oil fields, the central bank's dollar reserves would evaporate almost overnight. Without this vital life support, the bank would have no choice but to abandon the currency peg, letting the dinar float freely in a market that would have zero confidence in its future, leading to a swift, terrifying, and uncontrollable devaluation. We are not talking about a minor dip, we are talking about a Zimbabwe or Venezuela-style collapse, where the currency becomes virtually worthless, a self-reinforcing death spiral where the plummeting value destroys purchasing power, which in turn shatters the economy, which further crushes the currency. The human cost of this economic apocalypse is almost too horrifying to comprehend. Iraq is a nation heavily dependent on imports for its most basic necessities, including over 80% of its wheat and rice, and when the dinar collapses, the price of that food, along with life-saving medicine, baby formula, and energy, would skyrocket beyond the reach of the average family, leading to widespread hunger, preventable disease, and social unrest on an unimaginable scale. The very oil wealth that the dinar speculators bet on would be legally and financially siphoned away before a single dollar of it could ever be used to strengthen the national currency, revealing the tragic irony that the asset they believed would cause the dinar to rise would, under these conditions, be the direct instrument of its destruction. Furthermore, the climate of extreme political instability and the blatant violation of national sovereignty would trigger a catastrophic capital flight, with any remaining foreign investors, and indeed wealthy Iraqis themselves, rushing to pull every convertible asset out of the country, further draining the dollar reserves and accelerating the economic death spiral. The Iraqi dinar would become a pariah currency, untouchable by the international financial system, a tangible symbol of a nation whose economic sovereignty had been extinguished. This is the stark, data-driven reality that lies beneath the shocking headline. It is a story not of get-rich-quick schemes, but of a potential humanitarian catastrophe, where a political demand for payment translates into empty stomachs, bankrupt hospitals, and a generation of lost hope, fundamentally altering the strategic landscape of the Middle East and proving that the most devastating weapons in modern geopolitics are not always bombs, but sometimes, simply, a bill.